Well, elections determine a lot of things, and none more than this coming US election determining climate policy. The choice is really clear. If Donald Trump is re-elected president, then America is out of the Paris Agreement, withdrawing, in fact, on the day of the election. If Joseph Biden becomes the president, he says his number one decision is to lead America back in. And if Paris is our last best chance of avoiding catastrophic climate change before the end of the century, then you could say that no presidential election has been this important in a long time. There's been exploration of how the Chinese and Americans could collaborate more on climate from a group of people, and one Australian is in the middle of that group. He's Thom Woodroofe. Thom works as advisor to the president of a body called the Policy Institute of the Asia Society, New York based. The president of the Policy Institute is our own former Prime Minister Kevin Rudd. And Tom's been advising him on multilateral affairs, but more particularly recently on the notion of collaboration between China and the US on climate policy. There are times, given the pressures in the relationship, in recent weeks when that would look very far-fetched. But again, the prospect of a change of presidency and of Americans and Chinese thinking about this existential threat. Well, Thom, it's very good of you to make time for us, and let's start with the prospect of a Biden presidency and the very high priority the Vice President seems to be giving to climate, talking about climate-driven diplomacy. And I refer to some of the remarks he's made in his March-April 2020 Foreign Affairs article. I am reading this right, aren't I? That he's asking to be judged on what he would do as president on climate.
First of all, thanks very much for having me, Bob. It's a real pleasure to be able to do this. I think that's absolutely right. I mean, I think historically, and we've seen this throughout the Democratic primary period, we have seen climate elevated in a way that it has never been before. Part of the reason for that is that Democratic voters, especially, but also voters across the board, the polls are showing, are prioritising climate change in a way that they have not before. But then you have also seen that manifest at a very policy level in terms of the actual policies that each of those candidates have actually been putting out, including Vice President Biden. And I think that's a really pleasing thing because, as you also intimate, this presidential election is way more important than any others when it comes to the global fight against climate change. Part of the reason for that is the baseline that it's coming off with the Trump administration, which has taken many of the good work done, especially by the Obama administration, in more recent years backwards. But also because it comes at a really important global time, both in terms of the closing window to actually increase emissions reductions efforts and constrain temperature increases, but most particularly because it will come right before the next international diplomatic moment where that rubber hits the road, if you will.
So Biden is saying he will convene a global conference on climate. And there's even a hint in the literature of this being done within 100 days of his election. Is this being taken seriously within his camp? And what would you see coming out of a summit, and what kind of summit do you think it would be?
Really good questions. So, I mean, internally, one of the interesting dynamics which has also taken place throughout this primary period has been that each of the individual candidates themselves have been in many ways clamoured to get in front of each other on climate change. You've seen very strong platforms, not least by Jay Inslee very early on, more recently, particularly by Bernie Sanders and also Elizabeth Warren. And one of the Biden campaign strategies, definitely in terms of mobilising the Democratic base, has been to actually strengthen elaborate their own climate policies more and more in order to try and energise, particularly those on the progressive left of the Democratic Party. But either way, this is absolutely a core issue for the Biden camp and for the Biden campaign, and I think ultimately for a Biden presidency. One of the really interesting ideas that he particularly has espoused when it comes to his international climate elements, which aren't so much talked about actually in the campaign. Most of the focus has really been on the domestic climate policies. But one of the interesting ideas which he personally has thrown out there, and threw out there very early, was this idea to convene world leaders in Washington within his first 100 days. Now, some have said, look, given the current pandemic crisis, that might be an idea that would perhaps slowly slip by the wayside. But he's continued to repeat it. He repeated it as recently as Earth Day at the end of April, a couple of weeks ago. So to him, it really is a top-of-mind idea in terms of how to actually demonstrate that climate leadership. There's now, I think, a real debate amongst not just within his camp, but also within a lot of the wider American sort of international climate establishment, if you will, as to what's the best form for that to take. At its literal level, Biden has said he wants to bring all of those leaders to Washington, as I say, within 100 days. But in many ways, it might actually be better to do that later on in the year, particularly with a sort of pre-cooked notion around it, or, for example, after the United States would have brought forward its new 2030 emissions reduction target and use that as a lever to actually influence other countries. And one particular model that some people have spoken about, I personally think as well, is probably the best model, is not to necessarily convene a universal world leaders summit, not to invite 190 world leaders to Washington. Yes, that has a kind of powerful signalling moment, but actually the real metal, the real value of US climate diplomacy in at least the short term is pressuring the other big emitters. A lot of the smaller emitters are in fact doing incredible stuff. They're doing way more than in many cases could be expected of them, and in most cases way more than the major emitters are doing comparatively. So if the United States was able to focus especially on those major emitters, particularly through a vehicle such as, say, the Major Economies Forum on Climate Change, which was established about a decade ago, and that might allow them, for example, to concentrate that point of pressure and leverage on those countries. And as I say, the timing of when that might then best be could, for example, be in September of that year. Probably after the summer is when a lot of people think that the 2030 target, for example, would be on the table.
Yeah, so he's got a 2030 target. Is there any discussion, any controversy likely through the campaign to him saying net zero emissions by 2050? Is that broadly accepted? Is that consensus? Can he get away with that in America?
So the net zero target's a really good example, actually, again, of where all the different candidates probably helped peer pressure each other to a point of really strong policy. So the net zero by 2050 goal, I think, is absolutely an assurity. You can bet the house on a Biden administration being committed to that. What was interesting was actually that was the if you will, the conservative view within the Democratic primary race. Some candidates, Senator Sanders, for example, was advocating for complete decarbonisation by 2050. Others were calling for net zero a bit earlier, not much earlier, for example, 5 years or so. And a lot of candidates, Pete Buttigieg, Elizabeth Warren, they actually put on the table really elaborated plans to get there with a whole heap of milestone targets, for example, by decarbonising the electricity sector, which is one of the major sources of US emissions, by, I think, 2030 in some cases. So, yes, I think that's a core policy for Biden. It gels with most of the world. Around 60 or so countries, when I last checked, in the world have a net zero by 2050 target. It's widely accepted as being the milestone moment that countries need to work towards to stay within the temperature limits of the Paris Agreement, which are 2 degrees Celsius by 2100, striving for 1.5 degrees Celsius. It's something which many in the G20 have committed to look at. Unfortunately, not yet Australia, even though every state and territory in Australia is committed to net zero by 2050. But one important thing I think to note as well, including which you're seeing come out of certain elements of the American climate establishment, is the notion that this long-term goal of net zero by 2050 also needs to be something that they operationalise in their foreign policy, and particularly operationalise in their foreign policy with China, where it can provide a bit of a framework, if you will, for that bilateral relationship. So rather than looking at necessarily piecemeal opportunities and opportunities for leverage and influence, they can instead actually have a guiding North Star and use that as a frame of reference for everything that they would encourage China to do leading up to it.
Yeah, and in fact, I'm getting this from 3 other sources, that is, in addition to Biden. One is from the article by John Podesta and Todd Stern. Podesta was, of course, Chief of Staff to Clinton and a senior counsel to the Obama White House. In his article in Foreign Affairs, the current edition, he talks about the next president organising a meeting with the Chinese president, Xi Jinping, to collaborate on climate policy. Now, Podesta isn't the only one saying this. That hard-nosed practitioner of diplomacy, Kurt Campbell, who was Assistant Secretary of State on East Asian and Pacific Affairs under Hillary Clinton, said very much the same, increasing the collaborative element in the difficult, challenging bilateral that operates between Washington and Beijing, but making climate a very big feature of that. But even coming to the Republican side, I note those old stagers, James A. Baker III and George P. Shultz, put their names to an article urging effectively the right of politics to take climate seriously, and on the way through saying this, quote, "The United States and China could use the climate as a means of cooperating to bring greater prosperity to the world," unquote. That's coming from the Republican side. So maybe you and the think tank you're in, led by Kevin Rudd, have been doing your job very assiduously, because the notion of collaboration on climate between China and the US is coming up in the important policy literature that exists around the time of this presidential contest.
Well, I mean, there's a couple of things to say about that. I think, first of all, the joint announcement between Presidents Obama and Xi on climate change in November 2014, which really the foundation for that was actually set in the now famous Sunnyland Summit beforehand. But that joint announcement in 2014 was, in my view, as someone that worked on the Paris Agreement, the absolute game changer, the greatest catalytic moment in terms of actually that agreement being secured. Why? Because it sent a signal that the world's 2 largest emitters were committed to doing a deal 1 year later, in a way, for example, that we didn't have going into Copenhagen in 2009. That joint announcement was subsequently followed up by 2 others in September 2015 and in September 2016, I think it was. But what that shows you is just the absolute influencing power, both internationally, but also, frankly, within both the United States and China's own domestic constituencies, policy constituencies, for actually doing more themselves. It will be easier for the United States to be a climate leader domestically if China is doing more itself, and if China is doing more with the United States on climate. In terms of the dynamics, I think vis-a-vis a Biden administration on China and climate. I mean, look, first of all, I don't think anyone's going to be nostalgic that we can simply turn back the clock to 2014. It is, frankly, a very different world on both sides. There's a a very different Chinese foreign policy in many ways. There is you've seen some language thrown around, including by Vice President Biden in the debates, which might make that a little bit difficult. But what I think there is, and you're seeing this coming out from both sides of the aisle, is there's a real recognition that actually if you were to try and find one area of what is becoming an increasingly, by the day, difficult bilateral relationship, if you were trying to find one area where in fact cooperation is possible and actually helpful, it would be climate. And for the Chinese, I think they realise that also it's in their interest, as I say, for that domestic argument before, but also because they recognise that climate will be so central to a Biden administration that they don't want to necessarily be cutting across that. And internationally, they would be seen to be cutting across it, I think, if there was not necessarily that degree of cooperation sought or attempted to be sought with the United States. So I think for all those reasons, there's very, very positive tea leaves in terms of that. A lot will require presidential level diplomacy on both sides. I think it's something that needs to be led from the top. But I think there's really positive opportunities. And again, one that I mentioned earlier, which I think is actually in many ways potentially a bit of a blessing when it comes to this particular dynamic on climate, is the fact that the next United Nations Climate Change Conference, which was the 5-year moment on from Paris, where every country in the world, including Australia, is required to take another look at the targets that they took to Paris and seek to do more. That moment has now been postponed because of this pandemic and will come at the end of 2021. And what that means is that in the event of a Biden victory, the United States will obviously be bringing a higher target themselves, and that will help provide both the opportunity we were talking about earlier in terms of the magnifying effect internationally, but specifically an opportunity to really engage China in a pointy dialogue about their own Paris targets going into that moment.
Were Trump to be returned, America would not be part of that conference, would it?
So it wouldn't be part of. So there's the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. The Trump administration has stayed within, thankfully. The Paris Agreement under that, it has sought to withdraw from, and as you said in your opening, that withdrawal will actually go into effect the day after the presidential election, as it happens. Now, that's actually a pretty easy thing to reverse in the event of a Biden victory, thankfully. But I think actually a Trump re-election for this is, on one hand, I wouldn't say diabolical, but it's definitely, as it is, I think, for a lot of policy areas, it really does demonstrate that the Trump administration is perhaps becoming more of the norm in history in the direction of the United States than the exception. And that will obviously have an effect on climate change activity internationally, and that's obviously not a good thing.
But if Trump gets back and America is out of Paris, is America represented at that delayed Glasgow conference?
So they would have an ability to be represented as members of the Framework Convention, but they wouldn't be in the specific discussion on the Paris Agreement. And there would obviously not be, as a result of that, the requirement under the Paris Agreement to maintain an emissions reduction target.
Okay.
So there would be no pressure on them specifically to do that.
Let's get back to the prospect of a Biden presidency. He would be looking for an easy victory, I imagine, in talking about climate with China. Is he likely to get one when it comes to something he has said and Podesta has said is a useful goal, and that is persuading China that none of the loans and aid it extends under the Belt and Road Initiative should be for fossil fuel projects? Is that going to be an easy one for China to yield up in the early days of discussions with the new American president about collaboration on climate?
So that is a really great question, Bob, because I think, I mentioned earlier that the top of mind item that Biden talks about on the campaign trail when he does pivot to climate change internationally is his 100-day summit that he wants to convene. The second thing that he talks about is the need for China to have stronger environmental credentials in its Belt and Road Initiative projects. It's funding coal plants, for example, in many parts of the world, in Africa, in Asia, even in Eastern Europe, and Central Asia as well. So I think the interesting thing, though, about that is the manner in which he's talking about doing it versus, in many ways, what I would say is probably the most effective way of doing it. On the campaign trail, and yes, you would expect this to some extent, you're playing to certain audiences, Biden has spoken about convincing the Chinese, holding them accountable for these BRI emissions. Now, that's all well and good, but it's very difficult for one great power in the world to necessarily simply demand something of another great power and for them very generously to do that. I actually think it would be much more effective diplomacy, for example, to seek to engage the Chinese on this, to make it clear that this is a problem for them in terms of global optics. It's something which I think the United States can work with many of the BRI recipient countries to also make that point around. But I actually think that the greatest opportunity to actually get a bit of a change of direction in terms of the level of environmentalism that's considered as part of many of these BRI projects is to actually seek to engage in a race to the top with China on this. According to some reports, the total investment opportunity in BRI projects in terms of energy needs runs into the hundreds of billions of dollars. And one other element, and in fact actually probably an area where Biden has led compared to many of the other previous candidates on the Democratic side, has been talking about that investment opportunity globally, not in specific reference to China, but I think that this is a natural place to particularly take that. Because doing that in terms of the BRI recipient countries and seeking to actually provide a competitive source of finance for some of these projects actually helps China themselves, I think, approach that differently. So I would like to see a much more competitive approach on that area rather than necessarily one which is, frankly, a little bit more about confrontation, I think, at least in terms of the language.
Yeah, I think competition for Chinese BRI projects is very healthy. To have the Japanese, who are great builders of infrastructure, make commitments, especially given the shift recently in the Japanese political climate and in their corporate sector towards taking climate change more seriously. I think that's a significant trend. And enlisting the Japanese to offer money in competition with China in the clean green space would strike me as being something that Biden would be able to do. On the Chinese side, what do you pick up, without asking you to give away the content of confidential conversations, but what can you share with us about the readiness of China to deal with the new American president who has used tough language in his campaign, as all American presidential candidates do about China, but who is itching to get climate at the centre of a rejuvenated American foreign policy?
So looking at climate specifically, I think that there's actually, in many ways, a degree of nostalgia from the Chinese themselves as to that cooperation of yesteryear, and a desire to get back into that cooperative space again, for all the reasons we talked about earlier in terms of being helpful to their domestic constituencies, in terms of the benefits that can help them drive internally and for their own people. One of I think the really interesting dynamics that happened between Copenhagen and Paris was the level of domestic influence changing the Chinese policy approach versus actually international pressure, and that was around the level of pollution in its own cities, for example. So I think there's a desire, and there's, as I said, also I think there's a recognition that actually, if you were to try and compartmentalise part of the relationship, climate seems to be the logical one. It's the one where they can probably get the most gain, I think, frankly, if you look at it from a crude political perspective. In those joint announcements I mentioned in 2014, 15 and 16, in many ways, the value for China from those announcements, and don't get me wrong, China was doing good stuff, but in many ways, the value for them, I think, in terms of those announcements was that they actually got the stamp of approval from the United States in a way that they'd never really got before. And suddenly they were on the same pedestal as the United States, who they were able to kind of perhaps put some parameters around what they saw as actually the level of US action required. So it was in many ways a kind of win-win for them. It was much more difficult for the United States because they had to be quite conscious that they weren't just necessarily rubber stamping anything, but the desire to actually have that collective signal around cooperation with China was still in many ways paramount. So I think there's definitely all of those factors at play. At a broader level, at a bilateral level, it's becoming an increasingly complex picture by the day. It's becoming an increasingly worrisome picture as well. But I think, the hard heads also recognise that their foreign policy generally, and not just climate change, which is now, frankly, a big part of it as it is in the United States because of all the literature that you mentioned, I think they realise that, we need to recognise that no matter what we do, a Biden administration is going to be a bit of a climate hero on the world stage. And in that dynamic, all of the kudos and recognition that we have built up under the Trump years on climate change, but frankly just sticking around and not withdrawing from the Paris Agreement, not seeking to necessarily undermine anything, that position will frankly evaporate, and all of that opportunity for global influence and positioning and positive optics will vanish. So, as I said before, I think they recognise that they don't want to cut against that. And it's about finding a way that they can, I think, signal to the globe that they in the United States are cooperating on that, and do so in a way that actually allows them to still pursue their own goals and opportunities.
Well, that's a very positive view because it suggests the Chinese will see a benefit fed by this nostalgia for the response they've had to agreements before Trump with American presidents, and see a reason for collaboration. You see, what these former Republican secretaries of state are saying, and what Kurt Campbell and Podesta seem to have implicit in their argument, is that climate is a good platform for boosting the collaborative part of the US-China relationship, which is going to have more competitive elements and more security implications than in the past, but must have some collaborative content. That's what they're all saying. And I want to congratulate you and Kevin Rudd for your work in this space, for signalling it as a long-term area of research interest. And good luck to you with it. Just one thought on the China's domestic response, as opposed to what they're doing with BRI. When I spoke to Ross Garnaut, he said the most positive thing about world trends, the single most positive thing about world trends, is China's trajectory on carbon post-2030. He thought the shift to renewables, the dive in reliance on coal-fired power after 2030 in China was the biggest thing giving him confidence, some optimism about the world getting there.
I share Ross Garnaut's optimism, I have to say. The only footnote that I would make is just that in many ways, well, in fact, the science tells us this, that between 2018 and 2030, we need to halve global emissions. So in many ways, this decade is the critical year for climate action, which is why, again, I think that hopefully, the potential 8 years of the US being a really strong part of that global fight really matters. Really, really matters because in order to get to that goal, it requires a lot more effort than is happening now. But yes, there are some really positive trend lines in China. China's electric vehicle sales are more than the rest. Well, last year were more than the rest of the world combined. It is reducing its coal usage from its peak several years ago now. So there are reasons to be optimistic, but I think really now the fight is about the speed in which we can make that change, and not necessarily, I think, our long-term commitment to that change, where you're seeing businesses, you're seeing countries committing to things like net zero that we were speaking about before. But as I say, the timeline to do that is I think, the most consequential thing now.
Thom, thank you very much. Congratulations on that program you're engaged in. You've got to end by giving us a tip. You're in touch with a lot of influential Americans. I think you're helping shape their thinking on this subject. What are you prepared to say about how it goes in November?
Well, thank you very much for having me, Bob. I think it's got a long way to go yet. I mean, you're seeing campaigning play out now in a completely different way. I think there's a lot of, on the Democratic side, there's a lot of hope that Biden will prevail. But there's some wacky approval ratings floating around in terms of particularly the Trump administration's response to this pandemic. So I mean, for the hope of the climate, I am very hopeful that Biden will prevail come November. But I think the tradition of there being an October surprise this year has the potential to be a monthly occurrence between now and then, probably.
Thom Woodroofe, thank you very much for finding time to talk to us. Good luck with that work, and look forward to speaking to you again.
Thanks so much, Bob. Thank you very much.